I remember the moment like it was yesterday, the instant the forest turned from familiar to unknowable. I had been a ranger for more than a decade, patrolling the dense wilderness of northern Idaho, places where the firs stood so tall they seemed to pierce the sky, and the wind carried whispers that could make even the most seasoned hiker second guess themselves. My name is Aaron. I'm 37, and I've walked these trails more than most who call this forest home. I know every bend in the river, every ridge where deer feed at dusk, every hidden spring where the air smells of wet moss and iron. Yet, even after all these years, there are parts of this forest that make you feel like a visitor in someone else's nightmare. It was late September, and the mornings had started to bite with frost, though the sun still climbed lazily above the horizon, brushing the needles with gold. I was on routine patrol, checking remote campsites for abandoned trash and illegal fire pits, when I stumbled across a trail I didn't recognize. Not uncommon, this forest is vast, but something about the path felt wrong. The undergrowth had swallowed it almost completely, like it hadn't been walked for decades. My boots crunched dry leaves, and I realized I hadn't heard a bird in minutes. Not a single caw or song. Silence like that always sets my nerves on edge, and I chalked it up to the coming winter. As I pushed further, I noticed the backpack. It was wedged between two roots, half covered in dirt and dried leaves, almost invisible unless you were stepping directly over it. The canvas was faded, the leather straps brittle, as though it had been left there for an eternity. My heart skipped, though I tried to mask it with the professionalism that comes from years in the field. This wasn't unusual in itself, people lose gear all the time, but the tag nailed the feeling in my chest like a hammer. A name scratched faintly into the leather. M. Harlow. I froze. Michael Harlow had disappeared 30 years ago in this very forest. I'd heard the story countless times. A 19-year-old hiker, fit, prepared, vanished on a solo trip in early October, leaving behind only an empty tent and a journal that stopped mid-sentence. Despite searches, despite helicopters and dogs, no trace of him had ever been found. And now here was his backpack, as though the forest had been keeping it safe all these decades, waiting for me to find it. I knelt slowly, feeling the cold bite through my gloves as I lifted it. The leather crumbled under my fingers, brittle and dry, and inside, faint shapes suggested someone had left things in a hurry. A tattered notebook, a rusted flashlight, and a small, unidentifiable object wrapped in oilcloth. I didn't touch the latter immediately. Instinct told me some things are better left undisturbed. The notebook was more than enough to pull me into a world I hadn't walked yet. Opening it, the air seemed to change. The forest pressed closer, the shadows of the trees deeper, the silence heavier. The pages were yellowed, but the ink had survived, faintly etched like the whisper of memory. At first, the entries were ordinary, descriptions of the hikes, the wildlife, the changing weather, but then, near the middle, they changed. Harlow began writing about a feeling, a presence he couldn't name, a shadow that followed him through the trees even during the bright midday sun. He described sounds that no animal made, and at night, the whispering echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I could almost hear them as I read, the wind rustling like voices just beyond comprehension. My fingers gripped the notebook tighter, my pulse hammering in a rhythm that matched the sudden gusts around me. I didn't hear it at first, a snap of a branch, subtle but deliberate. My eyes darted toward the tree line. Nothing moved. I told myself it was a deer, a fox, maybe even a wind-blown limb. But the rational part of me, the part trained to trust instincts over explanation, flared warning. I could feel the tension building in the small of my back, the tiny muscles along my neck tightening as if the forest itself were leaning closer, listening. I stuffed the notebook back into the backpack, lifting it cautiously. The weight was heavier than expected, almost as if it carried the years of Harlow's fear, and I thought about taking it back to the ranger station immediately. But the moment I turned, I noticed the footprints. Not my own, though I followed the path just days earlier, and not the tracks of an animal. They were human, large, deep-set, leading toward a cluster of pines where the shadows pooled thickly, unnaturally. It didn't make sense, and yet I followed. You can't explain curiosity like this. It's magnetic, almost parasitic, pulling you toward the impossible. The air grew cooler, the scent of decay faint but unmistakable, and every step I took made the forest seem to tighten around me. I had been here thousands of times, but this place, this hidden hollow, felt like a trap of memory and moss. Then I saw it, the cave. It was small, almost hidden beneath an overhang, but unmistakable. Moss-cloaked stones framed the mouth, and inside, darkness pooled so thick it swallowed the light of my flashlight in a heartbeat. I remember the hesitation, the primal warning, the part of me screaming to leave, and yet I couldn't. I stepped in, letting the backpack trail behind me, half listening to the faint scuff of my boots against rock and soil. The cave smelled of damp earth and something older, metallic. I shivered, thinking about Harlow, imagining the fear that must have accompanied his final steps here. And then I heard it, a low, guttural breath. Not the wind, not an animal I could name, something immense, something deliberate, something that made the hairs along my spine stand on end. My flashlight wavered in my hand, casting shadows that jumped and quivered. The rational part of me screamed to run, to grab the backpack and sprint back to the safety of the road. But another part, a part that had walked these woods long enough to know the cost of fear, is stubborn. I stayed. I listened. There was a sound behind me, just inside the cave, and I realized the backpack had shifted. Something heavy pressed against it, pushing it slightly forward, toward me. I froze completely, my ears straining for the next breath, the next movement, and then, unmistakably, a whisper. So soft I thought it might have my own imagination. "Why are you here?" The voice, or whatever it was layered with something inhuman. Not just fear, but calculation, curiosity, recognition. And in that moment, I understood that Harlow hadn't just disappeared. He had found something in the forest that had found him back, something the forest had been keeping secret for decades, and I was staring into the same truth. I backed out slowly, leaving the backpack and the unknown creature or entity behind. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled out into the sunlight, the world of trees and frost and normal life crashing back around me. But nothing was normal anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being marked, of having seen something no human was meant to see. And as I carried the backpack back to the truck, I realized that some stories don't end. They just wait. Wait for someone to come along and open the wrong notebook, lift the wrong pack, step into the wrong cave. And in the silence afterward, when the wind passes through the trees, you can almost hear the whispers of all the lost hikers, all the rangers who came too close, and all the things the forest still keeps hidden. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Harlow, about what he might have faced, and about how fragile our sense of reason is when the world bends just slightly out of the light we trust. I understood, in that quiet terror, that the forest is alive in ways we don't fully comprehend, and that some lessons are carved not into books or ledgers, but into the bones of those who walk its shadows. By morning, I had made a decision. I left the backpack in the ranger station evidence locker, untouched by curiosity, untouched by interpretation. The journal remained in its brittle pages, a record of fear that I could study safely under light and walls. But the cave, the footprints, the whisper, those belonged to the forest. And I had learned something vital that even a seasoned ranger often forgets. Sometimes the bravest act is to step away, to respect what you don't understand, and to let the forest keep its secrets until the next person stumbles across them. Yet, even now, when I walk the familiar trails, I feel it. Not the fear of death, not the dread of wildlife or accident, but the knowledge that the forest remembers, that it waits, and that the line between protector and prey is thinner than we like to admit. And sometimes, when the wind brushes through the trees just right, I swear I hear a whisper again, just behind me, soft and questioning, "Why are you here?" After that first night, I started noticing the little things. Things that seemed normal until they weren't. Footsteps behind me and empty trails, the smell of smoke in the distance when no campers had been around for miles, shadows that moved in ways the trees shouldn't allow. I kept telling myself it was my mind, that years of solitude on patrol could play tricks on anyone. But deep down, I knew better. The forest had changed me. It had shown me a corner of itself I wasn't meant to see, and now it was testing me. A week later, I returned to the hollow. Not out of curiosity, no, not really, but out of responsibility. Someone had to catalog the site, mark it, and protect the public from wandering into something they weren't ready for. I brought rope, lanterns, and a GPS, everything a ranger would need to be careful. But even as I approached, the shadows seemed thicker than before, darker, almost clinging to my boots as I walked. The air smelled damp, but under it was a metallic tang, faint like blood long forgotten. I tied the rope to a tree and began inspecting the cave's entrance, flashlight scanning every corner. And that's when I noticed it. Small handprints pressed into the soft mud at the edge of the mouth, too small for an adult, too human for an animal. They were worn, eroded almost beyond recognition, but they were there. I felt a sudden, inexplicable pang of guilt, as if I had intruded on someone else's final moments. I bent closer, examining the prints, heart hammering. My rational brain tried to explain it, maybe a lost hiker decades ago, maybe a prank. But instinct told me something older, something unnatural had left them. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. My lantern cast long, thin shadows along the walls, and every echo of my boots sounded like another person following behind me. Then I heard it again, the low, guttural exhale, vibrating in the stone. I froze, flashlight sweeping the darkness, searching for a shape, a glint, anything, nothing. And then, unmistakably, a shadow darted across the far wall. My pulse shot upward, a sudden, hot fear gripping my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or bobcat. But the shape was too large, too upright, and the movement too deliberate. I tried to leave, backtracking to the entrance, but the air felt thicker, almost resisting my passage. And then the whispers started, soft, breathy, overlapping, sometimes questioning, sometimes accusatory. They were layered, coming from every direction, impossible to pinpoint. My rational mind screamed at me. It's just echoes, just wind. But my body knew better. I stumbled out of the cave, rope tangling underfoot, my ears ringing from the intensity of the sound. Outside, the forest was quiet again, but the silence was oppressive, heavier than before. I couldn't stop thinking about Harlow. What had he faced in this very hollow? The thought twisted in my gut. The backpack had been a beacon, a message across time, and I had answered. That realization gnawed at me every night as I lay awake in my cabin, staring at the ceiling, hearing the wind brush against the roof like soft fingernails. Every noise, every creak of the old wood felt like the forest speaking directly to me, testing my resolve, reminding me I had crossed a line. Days later, I returned again, this time with a colleague, a younger ranger named Kelly. She had joined the Forest Service only 3 years prior, and I like to think of her as sharp, fearless, someone who could walk through these woods without fear of the unknown. I didn't tell her the full story, not yet, but I showed her the backpack and the cave. Her eyes went wide when she saw the journal. I thought it was just a myth, she said, voice trembling slightly, that he just disappeared and nothing. I nodded, unable to speak. Words failed me. Together, we went to the hollow. I noticed immediately that the air had changed again, not just damp or metallic, but almost alive, pressing against our skin like the touch of cold fingers. The footprints from before were gone, replaced by new ones, taller, deeper, leading just inside the cave and stopping abruptly. Kelly shivered. Aaron, we shouldn't, but I had no intention of leaving. Something inside me, a stubborn, irrational part I couldn't deny, wanted to see, to understand, to witness whatever had claimed Harlow. I led her into the cave, lanterns casting their golden cones into the blackness. The shadows moved again, thin and agile, crawling along the walls, and then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very stones. Not a bear, not anything normal, something intelligent, something aware. And then it laughed, not a human laugh, deep, resonant, mocking, echoing through the cave like the sound of a canyon swallowing its prey. Kelly screamed, grabbing my arm. I felt it too, the primal instinct to flee, but also a deeper, gnawing curiosity. The journal had chronicled these sounds, these movements, these whispers. Harlow had known fear, and now so did we. The forest had opened its heart, and inside was something that refused to be named. I turned to leave, but the cave seemed to stretch. Shadows pooled at the mouth, blocking the way, twisting in shapes my mind couldn't comprehend. I felt the backpack shift on my shoulder, as though the weight of decades pressed into me, a tangible history of terror. And then, the whispers, almost pleading, "Why are you here? Why are you here?" The sound came from all directions at once. I realized the forest wasn't just around us, it was in us, pressing into our bones, marking us, testing our limits. I shouted, trying to break the sound, trying to remind myself this was still reality, still tangible, still something a human could survive. And the moment I did, a figure emerged. Not fully formed, not completely solid, but immense. Dark fur, long limbs, a presence so commanding I felt my knees weaken. Its eyes, or the sense of its eyes, fixed on us, measuring, understanding, judging. We ran. Kelly screamed again, dragging me toward the entrance, stumbling over rocks, slipping in the mud. Behind us, the sound followed, relentless, echoing, breathing, mocking. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The moment we broke free into the sunlight, the forest seemed to exhale, releasing us from its grip. But the sensation of being watched lingered, clinging to our shoulders, heavy as the backpack itself. Back at the ranger station, we locked the hollow in our reports, documented the backpack, but we left out the figure, the whispers, the growls. Who would believe us? Who could? And yet the memory burned into me, vivid as the frost in September, vivid as the shadows that clung to the tree line even now. I knew, in some quiet corner of my mind, that the forest had marked us, that it waited for the next hiker, the next curious ranger, the next soul bold or foolish enough to enter its hidden chambers. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind picked up again, brushing the cabin with that same whispering cadence. I could almost make out words, soft and hesitant, repeating in patterns my mind didn't want to translate. I imagined Harlow here, somewhere in the shadows of memory, still waiting, still marked, still listening. And I realized that some fears are more than instinct. They are inheritance, passed down by the land itself, by the memory of all who vanished, by the things that no one names. I left the forest early the next morning, not in fear, not in retreat, but in respect. You learn quickly as a ranger that not all threats are solved by courage, not all mysteries unraveled by reason. Some things demand patience, observation, and above all, reverence. The backpack remained in evidence, the cave sealed in our minds, but the forest itself carried its lessons forward. And I knew, every time I returned to the trails, every time I stepped beneath those towering firs, that the line between protector and prey is thinner than we admit, thinner than we can perceive, and thinner than I ever thought possible. Because the forest remembers. The forest waits. And some questions, like the ones whispered in the dark, aren't meant to be answered. I returned to the hollow one last time, not out of bravery or curiosity, but because the forest had a way of calling you no matter how hard you tried to ignore it. The backpack sat in the ranger station locker, untouched, waiting like a relic of something I could never fully understand. I wanted to see it in its natural context, to face the weight of history, of Harlow, of all the lost years, of all the whispers that haunted me at night. I drove deeper than I ever had before, the truck tires crunching over frost-kissed leaves, the cold morning air filling the cab. Even in the sunlight, the shadows of the forest seemed too long, reaching across the road, waiting for me to misstep. I parked at the edge of the path and stepped out. The smell hit me immediately. Wet earth, decayed leaves, and that faint tang of metal. The hollow had a presence, almost sentient, pressing against me like a tide. I took the backpack from the truck, carrying it carefully, aware that it was heavier than its physical weight, laden with decades of fear and with memories I could only imagine. Every step toward the cave made my pulse spike. Every snapped twig, every rustle of branches made my skin prickle. I tied the rope again, slower this time, cautious, every movement deliberate. The cave yawned before me, dark and uninviting, shadows pooling like spilled ink. Then I heard it, not the whisper, not the growl, but the sound of movement deeper inside, slow, deliberate, measured. Something was there, waiting, and it knew I had returned. I swallowed hard and stepped inside, letting the beam of my flashlight stretch into the darkness. The air was damp, thick, alive. The metallic scent was stronger now, sharper, more immediate. My eyes adjusted, catching glimpses of the walls, scratches, claw marks, patterns that felt intentional, almost like a language I couldn't comprehend. And then, as my lantern beam swung across the hollow, I saw it, the figure. It wasn't fully formed, not like anything I'd ever encountered. Its hair was black and matted, its eyes glowing faintly, its limbs long and impossibly agile. It watched me, not with curiosity, not with malice, but with intelligence. It knew I was there. It understood my thoughts, my fears, and in that moment I realized it had been observing Harlow the same way, waiting decades, patient and unmoving until someone returned. I wanted to turn and flee, but the backpack on my shoulder anchored me. I felt the weight of history, of every wrong step, every unanswered question. Then I heard the whisper again, closer, insistent, more human-like than ever. "Why are you here?" I swallowed, my voice tight. I need to understand. The figure tilted its head, considering me. It moved fluidly, almost gliding, yet making no sound. Shadows twisted along its form, creating shapes my brain refused to fully name. Then I felt it. A presence pressing into my chest, into my mind, a force that scattered my thoughts, pulling up memories from my childhood, fears I thought I'd buried, regrets I'd never confessed. The forest was reaching into me, testing me, measuring me. I thought of Harlow. I imagined his fear, his isolation, the endless days in that cave, the whispers, the growls, the presence he could never name. I felt the pull of history, the weight of a story left incomplete. And in that moment, I made a decision. I dropped to my knees, setting the backpack on the cave floor, my trembling hands hovering over it. I whispered into the darkness, "I will leave this here. I will respect what I do not understand." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the figure stepped back, retreating into the shadows, dissolving into the darkness of the hollow. The pressure lifted. The metallic scent faded. The forest exhaled, a long, deep sound like a sigh, like acknowledgement. I felt the tension drain from my shoulders, a release so profound it nearly buckled my knees. The hollow was still, silent, except for the faint rustle of leaves beyond the cave mouth. I left the backpack where it belonged, untouched, a marker of memory and respect. I walked out of the hollow slowly, letting every step imprint itself in my mind, aware of the forest's gaze but unafraid. I realized then something I hadn't understood during my first encounters. Bravery is not standing against what you fear. Bravery is knowing the boundaries of what can be faced and respecting the mysteries that will always remain. That night, back in my cabin, I wrote a report not only for the station, but for myself. I described the backpack, the hollow, the handprints, the journal, the whispers, and the figure I couldn't name. I wrote about the fear, the terror, the weight of decades pressed into a single object. And I wrote about what I had learned, that some stories are bigger than us, older than our reason, and that the forest holds memories not just of nature, but of every soul who wandered too far. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was peaceful. For the first time since finding the backpack, I dreamed of the forest without fear. I dreamed of sunlight through the firs, of wind on my face, of wildlife moving without menace. The whispers were gone, the shadows retreated. Yet in the quiet corners of the dream, I sensed the hollow still waiting, patient, eternal. Weeks passed and I returned to my regular patrols, yet everything had changed. Trails I had walked 100 times seemed narrower, darker, more alive. Birds called with voices I didn't recognize. The wind moved in patterns I couldn't explain. I was still Aaron, still a ranger, still protector of the land. But I was also someone who had seen the forest breathe, who had felt its memory, who had touched the edge of something older and more profound than human understanding. I share this not to frighten, not to boast, but to remind those who wander these woods and those who watch from home that nature is vast, patient, and alive in ways we rarely perceive. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Some fears are inherited, carried silently by the trees, the stones, the wind, and sometimes the bravest choice is the one that requires restraint, the one that respects the boundary between human curiosity and the forest's timeless memory. I often think about Michael Harlow, about the days he spent here, about the fear he endured and the story he left behind in a small, tattered notebook. I feel him sometimes in the wind, a faint presence, a whisper in the rustle of leaves. And I know that by respecting the forest, by listening and observing rather than conquering, I honor him and every other soul who vanished into the shadows, leaving behind objects, memories, and warnings. The backpack remains in the hollow. I do not visit it anymore. But on quiet days when the wind is still and the sunlight filters through the canopy just so, I can feel it, the presence of everything hidden, everything remembered, everything that waits. And I walk the trails with a new awareness, that fear is not weakness, that caution is not cowardice, and that the forest is both protector and teacher, harsh but fair, patient and eternal. I have learned that the line between courage and folly is thin as the shadows that cling to the trees. And I have learned above all that respect for the unknown is a strength few recognize. The forest has lessons that cannot be written in reports or journals, lessons carved into the bones of those who walk it with reverence. And so I continue my patrols, carrying knowledge heavier than any pack, listening to whispers that may or may not be real, seeing shadows that may or may not exist. I carry the weight of the backpack in my mind, in my memory, in my awareness, and I walk with the certainty that I have glimpsed something eternal, something patient, something alive. The forest is not ours to master. It is ours to witness, to respect, and to learn from. And in that understanding, I have found a strange kind of peace, a peace born not from conquering fear, but from accepting it, a peace born from walking with the memory of the lost, with the weight of history pressed into my shoulders, and with the knowledge that some secrets are best left undisturbed, waiting quietly in the shadows for the next person who dares to enter. Because the forest remembers. It always remembers. And for those willing to walk its trails with respect, it will teach you more than any human ever could. The first thing you should know is that the river never sounded right after dark, not in that slow, predictable way water usually moves. No, when night dropped into the canyon, the river began to breathe. I don't expect you to believe me. I barely believed it myself, even after all these years in uniform. But that sound is where everything started. That sound and the bones. My name doesn't matter anymore. My badge number matters even less. I've worked wilderness law enforcement for most of my adult life. Search and rescue, remote patrol, evidence recovery, the whole spectrum of things no one imagines when they picture a ranger in a postcard hat smiling beside a trailhead sign. Real work happens far from the roads and sometimes far from safety. I took this job for reasons that felt noble at 21 and pathetic at 39. I thought the forest would quiet the guilt I carried, guilt over a disappearance I failed to prevent. A kid went missing on my watch during my first year, 18 years old, full of adrenaline and bad judgment. He wanted to take a shortcut off the main loop. I was supposed to keep eyes on him. I blinked. He vanished. They never found more than his boot, wedged under a root like something dragged him down, foot and all. Every high alpine patrol, every night rescue, every godforsaken sweep through those towering pines has been an attempt to even a balance I know I'll never clear. The forest doesn't give back what it takes. It just waits until you offer more. I learned that truth again last fall on the Kestrel River Patrol. And what I saw there, what I touched, still wakes me up shaking like I'm back in that canyon, listening to something shift underneath the stones. It began quietly. My assignment was routine. A 4-day sweep along the lower canyon, checking for unauthorized camps, monitoring flood erosion, and following up on a series of reports from anglers who claimed that the riverbed looked scraped clean. The way they said it, eyes low, voices tight, made me pay attention. Fishermen don't use words like scraped unless something's wrong. The canyon was cold that week, colder than the season should have allowed. Frost clung to the edges of leaves like a second skin, and I noticed heat shimmer rising off the river even though the air hovered near freezing. Heat waves on water in October, at elevation. Nothing about it made sense. And then there were the footprints. About 5 miles upriver, I spotted the first set, bare feet, adult-sized, pressed deep into the mud as though whoever made them weighed twice as much as a normal person, except the stride was wrong, too long, and each print pointed slightly inward, like the legs were bowed or the hips weren't built right. But it wasn't just the strangeness of the prints, it was the temperature. The mud inside them was warm, warmer than my hand. I told myself what any sane ranger would, some barefoot hiker braving the cold, maybe intoxicated, maybe having a breakdown. People do worse out there. Hell, last year a guy hiked 12 miles nude because a voice in his head told him clothes were a trap for the soul. You get desensitized fast in this job, but these warm footprints in freezing mud, they put a weight on my chest I couldn't shake. I kept following the river. Around late afternoon, the canyon grew unnaturally quiet. Even the wind died in the pines. Anyone who's spent enough time outdoors knows that silence can feel predatory, like the land is holding its breath, waiting for something to step wrong. I told myself not to panic. I rationalized. Maybe animals sensed a storm. Maybe temperature inversion. Maybe nothing. Rationalization is the first crutch of a ranger losing their grip. By the time I set up camp, the sun had already sunk behind the canyon walls. A fog rose off the river, thick, wet, clinging to my sleeves like cold fingers. My breath looked blue against the dark. I built a small fire, more for noise than heat. Flames create a boundary. They trick the brain into thinking something out there is kept away. But the river sounded restless. It wasn't flowing. It was pulsing, a deep, rhythmic surge like the exhale of a massive animal. And underneath it, something else. I heard a scrape, a slow drag of something solid against rock. Then a splash, not the crisp slap of a fish, but something heavy being pulled under. I stood up, hand on my radio, though I knew no one would reach me out here. I edged closer to the water despite every instinct screaming the opposite. The fog twisted around my legs as if trying to hold me back. When I aimed my flashlight, the beam caught something pale beneath the water's surface. At first I thought it was driftwood, smooth, cylindrical, almost polished by time. But then I saw the curve, a familiar curve, a knee joint, a femur. The riverbed was full of bones, miles of them, packed and layered beneath the clear current like a graveyard turned inside out, some small as a child's pinky, some long as my arm, and every single one was perfectly smooth, no chips, no fractures, no marks of weathering or teeth. It looked as though something had sanded every bone to a pristine, unnatural finish. I should have backed away. I should have documented the scene and radioed for backup. But something about that river, it pulled at me. Not violently, more like curiosity twisted with dread, a hook baited with the impossible. I stepped into the shallows. The water was warm, impossibly warm, like bathwater. And it vibrated, subtly at first, then stronger, like a heartbeat. The bones shifted. They didn't tumble downstream or roll with the current. They rose, slowly lifting off the riverbed as though gravity had loosened its grip on them. My chest tightened, the flashlight trembled in my hand, and then from the fog behind me I heard a voice. A man's voice. Soft, calm, familiar. It said my name, not loudly, not urgently. Just a simple call, like someone trying to get my attention from across a trail. It sounded so clear, so normal, that for a moment I thought maybe a hiker had approached my camp while I was fixated on the river. I turned. No one stood there, just the fog, just the trees crowding the canyon walls. My radio crackled once, like someone whispering into it, then fell silent. When I looked back at the river, the bones had settled again, as if they'd never moved. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to step away, document, retreat, survive. But the other part, the part shaped by guilt, by 18 years of trying to make sense of disappearances, whispered, what if this is connected? What if the boy's bones are here somewhere, polished smooth like all the rest? And I swear, for a moment, I saw his face reflected in the water, older, unchanged, motionless. That broke whatever courage I had left. I staggered back onto the bank, boots slipping in the mud. My breath came hard and fast. My chest felt crushed, like invisible hands were pressing down. The voice called my name again, closer this time, directly behind me. But I didn't turn. I ran. I left the fire, the tent, the prints, the river of bones, everything. My legs carried me through trees that felt too close together, like they'd shifted inward just to brush against my shoulders. Something tugged at my pack twice. Something cold grazed the back of my knee. I didn't look. I couldn't. And through it all, the river kept pulsing behind me, a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt more like breathing than water. I didn't stop running until my lungs threatened to tear open. That was the first night. That was the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even try. I sat with my back against a dead cedar snag, headlamp fixed on the trees in front of me until sunrise bled through the canyon walls like a slow hemorrhage. Every rustle in the underbrush, every crack of frost off a branch, every gust of wind against my jacket felt like something approaching. The air was still warm near the ground, unnaturally warm, like the river's breath had followed me. When daylight finally arrived, it looked washed out and sickly, like the sun was straining to push through something heavier than fog. I forced myself to stand. My knees cracked loud enough that I instinctively glanced around, checking whether anything might have heard. I don't remember packing my gear. Muscle memory took over. Roll the sleeping pad. Cinch the straps. Check the sidearm. Check the radio. Check the map. But when I finished, my hands were shaking so badly I had to brace them against my thighs. Part of me wanted to hike straight out of the canyon and file a report. Another part, the reckless, guilt-warped part, insisted I couldn't leave yet. Not after finding bones like that, not with a voice calling my name in the dark, not with the possibility that some of those remains weren't old or weren't dead. I told myself I'd just retrieve the abandoned equipment at my camp and head back. A simple justification, a lie riddled with holes. The truth was darker. I had to see the river again in daylight. I had to see if those bones were still there. Rationality is a fragile rope, and mine was thinning fast. On my way back toward the river, I noticed something I had missed the day before. Claw marks in the trunks of several pines. But claw marks isn't quite right. These weren't raked across the surface. They were drilled. Perfect circular depressions, spaced evenly, like something had punched its fingers into the wood and pulled downward. The sap leaking from the holes smelled like sulfur. I moved slower after that. Even the wind sounded different, lower, almost like it carried a hum beneath it, a vibration that I could feel in my teeth but couldn't pinpoint. My shoulders twitched every few seconds, expecting a hand, or something colder, to settle on them. When I reached the riverbank, the fog was thinner than the night before, but the water still steamed like a geothermal pool. This time, I didn't approach right away. I crouched at the edge of the tree line and watched. The bones were visible even in daylight. Perfect, white, smooth as porcelain. And there were more of them. The current should have buried them or moved them downstream, but they lay undisturbed and arranged almost intentionally. Rib cages nestled against femurs. Vertebrae curled like coiled serpents. One skull, human, sat upright, sockets aimed toward the opposite shore as if it had been placed that way. A cold pulse ran up my spine, a primitive, paralyzing fear I hadn't felt since that missing boy 18 years ago. The river didn't just contain bones. The river kept them, and something was adding more. I took out my camera. My fingers were stiff, refusing to obey. When I finally clicked the shutter, the river seemed to respond. A ripple spread outward from the center. Slow, deliberate. The bones shifted again beneath the surface, rising slightly like something was lifting them from below. I took a step back, then another, and behind me, from somewhere inside the trees, came a low groan, like a boulder being dragged across gravel, followed by a breath, a long, exhaled sigh that fogged the air even though the temperature had risen. I spun around, hand over my holster. Only the forest, only the shadows between the pines. But the shadows were wrong. They were standing too still for the wind that pushed the branches above. Their shapes seemed a little too tall, a little too narrow, and one of them, one close to the river's bend, tilted its head. A shape shouldn't tilt its head. My instinct screamed at me to run again, but I forced my boots to stay planted. Rangers don't flee from shadows. Shadows can't hurt you. Shadows lie. But then something reached out from the nearest one, a hand, or the idea of a hand, long-fingered and faintly trembling like heat haze. I leaned back so hard I nearly fell into the river. The figure didn't step forward, didn't approach. It simply raised that long-fingered outline and pointed downstream. Not a gesture of welcome, a warning, or a command. I didn't need to be told twice. I backed away until the river's pulsing grew quieter. Then I turned and moved fast, following the bank downstream, boots crunching through frost that reformed instantly where the river's warmth didn't touch. I covered nearly half a mile before something new forced me to stop. A campsite. Not mine, someone else's. Someone unapproved, someone off-grid. 2 packs leaning against a tree. A fire pit with stones arranged in a spiral, not a circle, a spiral. Like whoever built it didn't know how fire pits worked or didn't care. A tent half collapsed as if someone left in a hurry, and scattered everywhere around the tent were clothes, shoes, a wallet, a half-open notebook with pages torn out. All the things a person should have taken with them if they'd left willingly. But no footprints. The ground was soft, muddy. It should have recorded every step, every drag, every struggle. Instead, the mud was smooth, as if no one had ever walked there at all. I crouched beside the notebook. The writing was frantic, drawn with heavy pressure like the person's hand was shaking or they were carving the words into the paper with fear alone. Most of the pages were illegible, smeared, waterlogged, but a few remained intact. I read them aloud without meaning to. It comes from beneath the stones. It watches from inside the water. It breathed warm air into my tent. Bones aren't buried, they grow. It is using our voices now. It used yours last night. My throat closed. It used mine. It had said my name. I don't know how long I knelt there, gripping the notebook like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The river gurgled softly behind me, a sound almost like amusement or hunger. Then I heard it again. A whisper. But this one wasn't calling my name. It was laughing. I dropped the notebook and drew my sidearm. My training told me not to waste ammunition on sounds, but the whisper wasn't just sound anymore. It was heavier. Closer, like breath on my neck. When I spun around, the forest was empty, the shadows still. The tent swayed once in a wind I didn't feel, but on the ground, half concealed beneath a layer of leaves, was a trail of bones, small ones, bird bones, maybe rodent, arranged end to end in a line leading away from the camp and down toward the riverbank. Not scattered, not natural, arranged, like breadcrumbs, like an invitation. I forced myself to breathe, slow, controlled. My pulse hammered against my ribs anyway, like it was trying to escape my chest. There are moments in this job when your instincts divide from logic, when survival climbs onto your shoulders and whispers what logic refuses to consider. In that moment, survival told me this: do not follow that trail. Do not approach the river again. Do not look down. Do not listen. But I did look. At the end of the bone trail lay a footprint, a single, deep, wide footprint in the mud, warm, fresh, pointing upstream. The same direction I had run from, the direction of the bones, and beside it, pressed sharply into the mud like something with impossible focus had engraved it, was a perfect imprint of a human hand. Except the fingers were twice as long as mine, and there were 6 of them. My radio crackled again. This time a voice came through clearly. My own. "Come back," it said. "We're not finished yet." I dropped the radio. Not out of fear. Fear I could have managed. It was the recognition that unmade me. Hearing my own voice come through on a channel that required a finger to press the transmit button. Hearing it speak words I would never say. Words spoken with an edge of calm I didn't possess anymore. The radio hissed once and went silent. No static, no wind noise, just nothing. Like something on the other end was waiting for me to answer. I forced myself to walk backward, step by slow step, eyes on the bone trail, because some instinct told me that turning my back would be a mistake I'd never correct. The air thickened as I moved, as if the canyon itself had noticed my hesitation and was trying to keep me close. When I finally reached a cluster of boulders far enough from the water that the warmth faded and the frost returned, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. My breath came out normal temperature now, cold, human. I clung to that like it meant something. My mind tried to rationalize as always. The radio malfunctioned, the campsite was old, the bones were sluiced smooth by minerals in the water, and the figures in the trees were tricks of fog and light. But my rationalizations felt brittle, fragile, paper shields against teeth I had to keep moving. Downstream was the only direction that didn't feel suicidal. But the forest changed as I walked. Not in big ways, no sudden cliffs or abandoned shacks or new canyons splitting open. It changed in the small, insidious ways your brain catches only when it's already close to breaking. Trees leaned a few degrees differently than they had earlier. Boulders had unfamiliar grooves, like something had been resting against them for hours. The mud under my boots felt softer, as though something had passed through moments before. Worst was the smell. Wet fur, burnt hair, and underneath it all, the bitter metallic scent of blood long dried but never washed away. The smell wove through the trees like a warning sign written in the oldest language on earth. I tried not to breathe through my nose, but every inhale made it worse. My flashlight, still clipped to my vest, caught something glinting on a low branch. I moved closer, expecting sap or frost. It was a tooth. Long, narrow, smooth, not animal, not human, something in between. More teeth lined the branch, and the next, and the next. Hundreds of them, arranged in perfect symmetry. My gut twisted. No predator organizes its kill like art. The forest was watching me, studying me, placing things where I would find them. That was when I realized I was being herded, downstream, toward something it wanted me to see. By late afternoon, the canyon walls tightened into a narrow corridor where the river slowed to a deep, glassy channel. The air warmed again, rising in waves like heat escaping an oven door. My skin prickled with sweat, even though I wore only a thin base layer under my uniform. I checked my canteen, half full. Checked my radio, dead. Checked my sidearm, loaded. None of it comforted me. The downstream corridor led to a clearing, round, flat, framed by enormous pines. I remembered this place from old logs. A mining settlement once stood here nearly a century ago, before it burned down in a wildfire. People said the fire moved strangely, skipping over brush and leaping across the river like it chose what to consume. When I stepped into the clearing, it felt like I had entered a place that remembered every scream it had swallowed. The soil was soft beneath me, too soft. It gave under my boots like packed ash. The river widened here into a slow pool, dark, quiet, opaque. No steam rose from it, but I felt warmth radiate off its surface like the breath of something massive waiting just out of sight. Then I noticed the structures. Not intact buildings, those had burned long ago, but the footprint of them. Faint depressions where cabins used to stand. Straight lines where foundations had lain, a square outline of what had once been a small storage shack or root cellar. That square was different. The ground there had collapsed inward, forming a sinkhole about 6 feet across. I should have walked past it. I should have walked past everything. I should have kept moving until I reached the trailhead or civilization or any place where the air didn't taste like something else's breath. But the sinkhole pulled my gaze. Not curiosity. Recognition. I'd seen a similar collapse 18 years ago when the boy vanished, the place where they found his boot. The ground had looked disturbed in the same way, as if something had tunneled just beneath the surface and the earth had finally caved. Against my better judgment, I approached the edge. The sinkhole was deeper than I expected, 10 feet, maybe more. Cool air drifted up despite the warmth of the clearing, a contradiction that made my skin crawl. Something down there smelled like wet stone and old copper. I leaned forward. There were bones inside, not scattered this time, stacked, arranged into spiraled columns twisting up from the floor of the pit like primitive architecture. Vertebrae, mandibles, femurs, ribs, all fit together with unnatural precision, like someone had built them as supports for an underground chamber. My vision blurred for a second. Not from fear, from recognition. At the top of the nearest column was a skull. Human. The bone polished smooth and pale. A crack curved across the left frontal ridge, the exact shape I remembered from a photo years ago. A trauma the missing boy had sustained long before he vanished. My pulse plummeted into a slow, frozen beat. That was his skull. It had to be. I reached down with a trembling hand. My fingers brushed the top of it. The ground beneath me hissed. Not the dirt, not the stones, the air. Like something below had inhaled sharply. The soil shifted under my weight. I stumbled backward, boots scraping across the ash-soft dirt. My mind screamed to run, to escape, to erase the sight of that skull from memory. But before I could stand fully, something touched my ankle. Not a hand, not a claw, something smooth and cold, like a length of polished bone sliding out of the earth. I kicked hard, scrambling away on my elbows and heels until I slammed against the trunk of a pine. My heartbeat hammered in my throat. I pointed my flashlight at the sinkhole. Something moved inside it. At first, it looked like the bone columns were swaying. But then I realized the movement didn't come from the structures. It came from what coiled through them. Something pale and jointed and impossibly long, sliding up through the spiraled architecture it had built. A section of it lifted toward the surface. The air changed, thickened, like the forest was holding a breath again. My chest tightened so sharply I thought my ribs were collapsing inward. And then I heard it. Not a voice, not a whisper, a vibration. It thrummed through the soil, through the water, through the marrow of my bones, and woven into that vibration was the faintest trace of something human, something familiar. I heard the boy's voice, weak, begging, "Don't let it be me again." My vision went white around the edges. My breath froze inside my chest. The thing in the pit shifted again, rising higher. A shape began to form at its tip, a suggestion of a face carved from bone, smooth and expressionless, with hollows where eyes should have been. And then it tilted its head, exactly the way the shadow had earlier. The same gesture, the same impossible awareness. I backed up too fast, tripped over a fallen branch, hit the ground hard. Needles stabbed into my palms. My flashlight rolled toward the river, illuminating nothing except the wall of trees that somehow looked closer now, as if they were leaning in. The bone face rose a little more, and then it sank, slowly, deliberately, disappearing beneath the spiraled columns as though returning to a deeper chamber. The vibration stopped. Silence swallowed the clearing. But the pit was still breathing. I could see the faint rise and fall of damp earth. And I knew, without logic, without doubt, that it wasn't done with me. I don't remember standing. I don't remember grabbing my flashlight. I don't remember choosing a direction. All I remember is running. Branches tore at my sleeves, roots grabbed at my boots. Something cold brushed the back of my neck like a finger made of air. I didn't look back, not even once, because I knew with a certainty deeper than fear, that if I looked, it would be there, in the trees, in the river, in the ground beneath my feet, everywhere, waiting. I ran until the forest thinned and the canyon opened just enough for the sky to bleed through in narrow streaks of blue-gray. By then, my lungs felt like they were filled with splinters. My vision pulsed at the edges. Every breath tasted metallic, like the air had changed composition since the moment I looked into that pit. I slowed only when my knees buckled and I had to brace myself against a boulder slick with condensation. My hands trembled uncontrollably. I pressed my forehead to the cool stone, trying to force my mind to settle. But it wouldn't. Every rational thought broke on the same jagged point. The skull was his, the missing boy. 18 years gone, never found. Now a pillar in a cathedral of bones beneath the earth. A sickness swept through me, not just grief, not just horror, but a deep, violating sense that something had been rewriting the history of this land long before I ever stepped foot into it. Something I'd stumbled into by accident. Something that wasn't finished with me. The wind shifted and carried a new sound, not the river, not the trees. A single sharp tap, then another, a rhythmic, deliberate knock against wood. I lifted my head, scanning the tree line. The tapping continued, slow, evenly spaced like someone lightly knocking on a door. But there were no doors out here. I pushed away from the boulder, forcing my legs to obey. The tapping grew louder, guiding me toward a grove of old spruce. Their trunks twisted in ways spruce aren't supposed to twist, spiraling around themselves like something had gripped them and torqued them slowly over years. The tapping came from behind one of them. I approached cautiously, sidearm drawn. Tap, tap, tap. The tree's bark was scarred with long gouges, deep, smooth channels carved in precise lines, not claw marks, not tool marks, more like something had pressed a hot cylindrical object into the wood again and again until it branded a pattern. I reached out, touching the grooves. The bark was warm. I pulled my hand back. Tap, tap, tap. This time the sound came from the other side of the grove. Something moving, something circling. My throat constricted. I moved quietly, boots sinking into soft needles. The trees leaned inward as if listening. The tapping continued, moving around me, always behind a trunk, never quite visible. It sounded almost polite, almost patient. Then something brushed my ankle. I nearly fired, whipping the flashlight downward so fast the beam fractured across the roots. No creature, no hand, only a bone. A single vertebra, smooth, white, polished, rolling in a slow arc until it bumped against my boot. My stomach lurched. Then 2 more bones rolled out from under the brush. Then 3. Then dozens. They clattered softly, gathering around my feet like toys returning to a child. I backed up, breath ragged. The tapping stopped. The forest went dead silent. And then, somewhere deep in the grove, something inhaled. A long, shuddering breath that made the branches tremble, a breath too large for lungs, too vast for anything above ground. My legs moved before I could think. I ran again, crashing through the trees, ignoring the sting of needles slicing my face. The forest blurred. I didn't know if I was going towards safety or deeper into hell, only that if I stopped, the thing breathing in the spruce would finally exhale, and I would feel it. I burst into another clearing. This one was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The grass was flattened in wide circular patterns, perfect rings, each one a little larger than the last, like ripples frozen in the earth instead of water. The air pressed against my skin, heavy electric. My flashlight flickered even though the batteries were new that morning. At the center of the clearing lay a deer, or what had once been a deer. Its hide was intact. Its eyes were open. There were no wounds, no blood, no signs of struggle. But its entire skeleton had been removed through a single, smooth incision down the spine, an incision so thin I wouldn't have noticed it if the body hadn't been sagging like an empty sack. The skeleton lay beside it, every bone polished, every bone arranged in perfect anatomical order. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't predation. This wasn't scavenging. This was extraction. Deliberate, meticulous, controlled. And then the temperature dropped, not gradually, instantly. Frost formed on the deer's fur in seconds. Ice crystals spread across the polished bones like veins. My breath spilled out in thick plumes that froze midair before dispersing. My eyelashes stiffened. I shined the flashlight around, teeth chattering. Silhouettes lined the tree line, too tall, too thin, too still. Their heads tilted in the same impossible angle as the thing in the pit. One of them stepped forward. No footsteps, just movement. A limb extended, not quite an arm, not quite a branch, not quite bone, but something that contained the essence of all three. It touched the air, and frost spread outward from that point like ink dropped in water. My lungs constricted. The air was too cold to breathe. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape the ring of frost creeping toward me. My boot caught on a root, and I hit the ground hard. My head spun, my vision blurred. The silhouettes didn't move closer. Not yet. They watched, waiting, studying. Then the ground beneath me vibrated, a deep, subterranean tremor, like something enormous dragging itself through tunnels far below. The soil around my hands warmed suddenly, steam rising where my palms touched the earth. The cold and heat warred around me. Two forces, two intentions, both converging. And I was caught in the middle. A voice whispered in my left ear. Not mine, not the boys. Something older. You're late. I twisted away, scrambling toward the trees, but another whisper pressed against my right ear. This land remembers debts. I ran again, blindly, desperately. Branches whipped my face, rocks tore at my boots. My heartbeat drowned out all other sounds except one. Footsteps behind me. Soft, precise. Too many joints bending in ways no human could. I threw myself down a narrow slope, sliding through loose soil and pine needles. My shoulder slammed into a fallen log. Pain radiated down my arm, but I didn't stop. I crawled beneath the log, pressing myself into the shallow space between earth and wood. The footsteps approached, slow, measured, calculating. I held my breath. I didn't dare blink. A silhouette moved past on the other side of the log. It was taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its torso yawned wide and narrow at once, like it was built on a different axis. Its limbs were long arcs instead of straight angles. Segments. Too many of them. And its head was smooth bone, polished, featureless. It stopped inches from where I hid. The forest went silent. Then something pressed against the log above me. Not a hand, not a foot, something round, smooth, heavy. A skull, rolling slowly back and forth as if listening for breath beneath the bark. I clamped my mouth shut so hard I tasted blood. The skull paused, tilted, waited. I counted the beats of my heart, went 30, 40. The skull rolled away. The footsteps receded into the trees. Only when the forest grew still again did I crawl out from under the log, shaking so violently I could barely stand. I wanted to scream, I wanted to collapse, I wanted to disappear. But the river wasn't far. I could hear it now, its pulse echoing stronger than ever, calling me back, pulling me. And I realized with a sickening clarity, no matter where I ran, it would lead me back to the water. Because the thing beneath the bones wasn't chasing me. It was guiding me. The forest funneled me downhill whether I wanted to follow its pull or not. I tried veering left, tried climbing back toward the ridge, tried cutting through the undergrowth where the pines grew thick and needle-dark, but every alternate path sloped back toward the river. Every ridge terminated suddenly in vertical drop-offs I didn't remember from any map. Every game trail looped in on itself. Every landmark I relied on had shifted, just slightly, like the forest was rearranging itself around me. My breath grew ragged. The air warmed again. A low, subterranean hum vibrated through the soles of my boots, and above all of it, the river's steady pulse beckoned like a heartbeat I was involuntarily sinking to. I broke through the tree line into a narrow ravine scattered with boulders. The stones were crusted with mineral deposits, white, chalky, smooth, the same smoothness as the bones. For one moment, I let myself believe the canyon floor might offer escape, but then I saw the path ahead. Carved into the rock wall beside the river was a narrow opening, tall, black, unnatural. A vertical slit, no more than 2 shoulder widths across, but clearly not a geological feature. There were scrape marks around the edges, not from picks or tools, from something harder, something that had pushed through the rock, a cave, or a tunnel, or an entrance meant for something that didn't care about human dimensions. The air around the opening was hot, not warm, hot, like when you open the steel door of a blast furnace. Heat shimmered in visible waves, distorting the dead brush around it. Yet the ground beneath my boots remained cold. Contradictions stacking on contradictions. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct I had, every piece of training, every survival lesson I'd internalized, screamed at me to turn around, to flee, to claw my way out of the canyon, even if it meant ripping the skin off my hands. But the river beside me pulsed again, a deep thud, like an enormous organ beating once beneath the water. The heat intensified, and from inside the slit, something exhaled. A rush of warm air swept across my face, carrying the smell of minerals, blood-soaked soil, and something far older than any living creature. My throat tightened. My knees almost gave. Then, impossibly, I heard a voice from inside the dark. A boy's voice. Thin, breaking, begging. Please don't leave me again. My heart collapsed inward. Every atom of guilt I'd carried for nearly 2 decades detonated. I moved toward the opening. Not because I should, because I couldn't not. Because whatever lived under this land knew the exact wound to reach inside me and twist. The cave swallowed sound the instant I stepped inside. No echo. No crunch of gravel underfoot. Just silence pressing against me from all directions. My flashlight beam sliced through a corridor of smooth stone. No natural formations. No rough edges. The walls were rounded, ribbed like the inside of a throat. As I walked deeper, the temperature changed again. Dropping so fast my breath crystallized at arm's length before falling like dust. Frost spread across my sleeves. The flashlight's metal casing bit into my palm like ice. But ahead of me, the tunnel glowed faintly. A dull, phosphorescent shimmer. Pale, soft, undulating. The same cadence as the river's pulse. I quickened my pace. The ground trembled underfoot. A low rumble, steady, rhythmic, like something massive dragged itself closer beneath the surface. The tunnel branched abruptly to the right, but the glow came strongest from the left. I followed the light. The corridor opened into a cavern so vast I couldn't see the ceiling. My flashlight beam vanished upward into darkness without returning. The cave floor was smooth, polished, curved into shallow depressions like the remnants of enormous footprints. And at the center of the cavern lay a pool. The glow emanated from it, soft, sickly yellow-white, lighting the chamber in uneven pulses. The air above the water rippled with heat. Bone-white mist coiled from its edges like steam from a boiling pot, except the temperature near the pool was freezing. Contradictions. Always contradictions. And scattered around the pool were bones. Thousands, tens of thousands. Rib cages fused into spirals. Femurs bent into arches, skulls stacked into pillars that reached halfway to the ceiling. They weren't remains, they were architecture. The entire chamber was built from what the land had taken. I stepped closer despite the shaking in my legs. The surface of the pool began to shift. A shape rose beneath it, long, pale, segmented. Not a body, not a limb, something in between. It undulated like a serpent, but articulated like a spine. My breath stopped. The shape lifted higher. Bones clacked softly against one another. A smooth, featureless mask broke the surface, bone-white, rounded, eyeless. The same shape from the pit, the same tilt of the head. It was enormous. Bigger than the tunnel should have allowed, coiled deeper than the cavern should have held. Its presence pushed against my mind like invisible pressure. My thoughts scrambled. Memories flickered. Fear rippled through my spine like electricity. Then the mask turned toward me. It didn't have eyes, but I felt it see me. My skin prickled, my heartbeat faltered, my knees buckled. Something cold slipped into my thoughts, through them like fingers parting pages of a book. I tasted soil in my mouth, heard rushing water, felt the weight of stone, and then a voice rose from the creature. Not external, internal, inside my skull. You were always meant to return. I staggered backward, nearly slipping on a polished rib cage. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the bone pillars, each one casting tall, trembling silhouettes. The voice pressed harder. 18 years ago, he was chosen, not taken. You left, but he stayed. Now you return. The ground remembers those who turn away. My throat closed. I forced words out anyway. What do you want? The cavern pulsed. Another ripple of heat swept across my face, but the air remained bitter cold. The creature tilted its bone mask again, the way an animal examines prey before deciding where to bite. You! A rush of vertigo hit me. The floor lurched. My vision warbled. No, I gasped. I'm not I'm not part of this. You were always part of this. My flashlight flickered. The cavern walls contracted. The bones shifted like the room inhaled. I stumbled back toward the tunnel. My boot struck something soft. I looked down. A backpack. Mud-stained. Partially crushed. The zipper broken. A patch stitched onto the front. A faded youth climbing club logo. One I remembered from a missing persons bulletin. The boy's pack. The breath left my body. You left him, the voice murmured. You left him here with us. I turned and ran. The floor pitched under me. The bones rattled in disapproval. The tunnel twisted, narrowing, choking off the path behind me like the cavern was collapsing. I slammed into the walls, scraping my shoulders raw, but pushed forward anyway. The creature's voice followed. We watched you. We waited. You carried the shape of guilt. You carry it still. My legs trembled so violently I nearly fell. The tunnel brightened behind me, the glow intensifying, chasing me like a second sun. I crawled the last few feet, claws of panic tearing through my ribs as the exit slit appeared ahead, a sliver of cold air, a promise of escape. I launched myself toward it. Something cold wrapped around my ankle. Smooth, hard, unyielding, a bone loop, a ring, a shackle. It tightened, pulling me back toward the glow, toward the creature rising behind me. But the soil near the entrance was looser, softer. I clawed at it with wild desperation, digging my fingers into the earth until they bled. My other boot caught on a root. I kicked. I twisted. I ripped free. I tumbled out of the tunnel and collapsed onto the gravel of the riverbank, gasping, retching, clawing at the ground like an animal dragged from slaughter. The tunnel mouth behind me pulsed once. An exhale. Then the darkness inside receded. The creature did not pursue me, which was somehow worse, because it meant it didn't need to, because it meant this was never about the chase. It was about where it was leading me. Back to the river, back to the bones, back to the moment it wanted me to break. When I crawled out of that slit in the rock, the sky above the canyon had darkened into that dead, bruised color that always hangs between storm and nightfall. But there was no storm coming. The air was too still, too watchful. I pushed myself up, shaking violently, my palms torn open, my ankle throbbing where the bone loop had gripped me. The river pulsed louder now, louder than wind, louder than the forest, louder than my own heartbeat. Each throb pushed warm air across the bank like a giant buried stomach contracting. The bones in the riverbed shimmered beneath the surface, catching what little light filtered through the clouds. They didn't just rest there anymore. They spiraled, slowly, deliberately, curling toward the center of the river like the entire canyon was feeding something. And somewhere beneath it all, the creature's voice pressed against the inside of my skull. You are late. I steadied myself against a boulder slick with moss. My thoughts were frayed wires, sparking in different directions. My vision blurred at the edges, the world tilting like the canyon had been built on a hinge. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If I didn't get out of this river corridor now, I never would. I limped upstream, not toward the way out, but toward the shallow bend where I'd first seen the bones. The fog thickened again, swirling around my knees like it recognized me. The warmth of the river intensified. My boots slipped on wet stones. The riverbank narrowed, the canyon walls closed in, and eventually, before I reached the bend, the ground disappeared entirely, replaced by smooth river stones arranged in unnaturally perfect rows. Touching them made something inside my wrists vibrate. The river's pulse reached a crescendo. Thud, 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 a heartbeat demanding attention. And then through the fog, I saw a silhouette standing on the other side of the water. At first, I froze. My mind latched onto the vague human shape, too small to be one of the towering silhouettes from before, too lean to be a ranger. It took me several seconds to understand why the figure looked familiar. The posture, the way the head tilted slightly forward, the way one boot was planted at an angle, as if favoring an old injury. The missing boy, except older, aged into the adult he never got to become. His hair was longer, his clothes shredded, his skin pale and smooth like the bones in the water. I blinked hard, once, twice, 3 times. He didn't disappear, but he didn't breathe either. He just watched me, unmoving. A whisper rose from the river. Not from the water, through it. He stayed. I shook my head violently, as if I could rattle the illusion loose. "You're not him," I said. My voice cracked. "You're not." The silhouette on the opposite bank lifted one arm, slow, stiff, puppet-like, and pointed downstream. The same gesture the shadow figure had made earlier. Something snapped inside me. I turned to run, but the earth beneath my boots trembled. The riverbed shifted, the bones rose again, swirling faster this time, like spinning upward in spiraled columns like the ones in the underground chamber. A low groan rolled through the canyon, so deep it rattled my teeth, so ancient it made every instinct inside me recoil. The silhouette across the river moved, not closer, not toward me. It sank. Its legs folded like wet paper, its torso collapsed inward, its head tipped back, and it dropped straight into the river without a sound. No splash, no ripple, just gone. My vision tunneled. The fog closed in, compressing around my ribs like a vice. I staggered sideways, falling to one knee. The warmth from the river brushed my face again, an almost affectionate heat, as though something massive leaned close to smell me. The voice returned. "You carry the shape of guilt, it softens the bones." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice was inside, chewing through reason. "You left him, but you returned. We waited." The river churned. The spirals of bone lifted higher. The water glowed faintly with the same sickly pulse as the cavern pool. Then the truth dropped into my mind, not spoken, not shown, but imparted. This thing didn't simply kill, it took. And what it took, it reshaped. What it reshaped, it kept. What it kept, it used. The bones were not remnants, they were raw material. My breath collapsed into shallow gasps. Something broke the surface of the river. Not a head, not a limb. Something else, a long segmented arc of bone, rising like the spine of a great serpent surfacing for air. Water streamed off its polished surface in sheets. Then another segment rose. Then another, each taller than the last. A structure, a body, a colossal skeleton built from thousands, maybe millions of human and animal remains fused together into something animate. The river convulsed. The creature's bone mask emerged at the apex of the arch, rotating slowly until it faced me. Then, impossibly, it mimicked my voice. "You left me." I staggered backward. Cold fire shot down my limbs. My throat constricted so tightly I could barely force sound out. "No," I rasped. That's not me." The bone mask tilted. "You are late." The world narrowed. The canyon walls seemed to pulse with the creature's rhythm. The river stones vibrated. The fog thickened until it clung to my skin like wet cloth. And then I heard movement behind me. Not soft, not cautious, heavy, deliberate. I spun around, raising my flashlight. Its beam jittered, the bulb flickering under the pulse of whatever electromagnetic nightmare saturated the air. The silhouettes had returned, tall, thin, jointed wrong. Standing in a half circle around me, their heads tilted in unison, their limbs hanging like tools they had not yet been instructed to use. Not alive, not dead, carved from the creature's will. They blocked the way out, every way out. The river roared behind me. The canyon closed ahead of me. The silhouettes tightened their semicircle. And for the first time that day, I understood not just fear, but helplessness. The true kind. The kind that strips thought from bone, the kind that leaves only silence in the mind. The voice spoke one last time. "You carried guilt long enough. Now let us carry you." The ground softened beneath my feet like the soil had turned to warm mud. My boots sank an inch, then another. My pulse exploded into frantic beats. I lurched backward, but the river surged upward behind me, rising in a boiling column of bone-white water. The silhouette stepped forward. I fired my sidearm. The muzzle flash illuminated their bodies, hollow, boneless, skin stretched taut over emptiness. The bullets passed through. The silhouettes kept coming. The river reached my waist, then my chest, then my throat. I gasped, choking on heat and ice at once. The bone spirals collapsed around me like the ribs of a great animal closing. Hands, smooth, cold, many-jointed, wrapped around my arms, legs, torso, chest. They weren't pulling me down, they were holding me upright, presenting me. The last thing I saw before the river swallowed my vision was the creature's bone mask lowering toward me and tilting, as if studying its newest piece. Then everything went black. I don't know how long passed before I crawled onto the bank, gasping, my lungs screaming for air. The silhouettes were gone. The river was calm. The bones settled, the canyon silent. I was alone, or it allowed me to believe I was. My clothes were dry, my skin unmarked. The only sign anything had happened was a new imprint on my ankle. 6 long fingers, smooth, perfect, bone white. I don't know how I escaped. I don't know why it let me go. But I can tell you this. Every night now I wake to the sound of the river breathing beneath my floorboards, because I didn't escape it. It followed me. And one day soon, when I'm finally too tired to resist, I know the ground will open, the river will pulse, and the thing beneath the bones will tilt its head and say, "You are late." I should have died the night I saw her. The memory isn't sharp, it never is. It feels like a photograph left out in the rain too long, edges warped, colors bleeding together. But I remember the scream, the way it fractured the air around me like glass shattering in slow motion. My name is Daniel Shaw. I am, or I was, a forest ranger in the northern reaches, where the trees grow so thick you can't tell the sky from the canopy until the sun breaks. I took this job thinking I wanted solitude, thinking I could outrun everything I had ever done wrong. I wanted clean air and dirt under my nails, a place where the only crimes were small, poaching, illegal fires, campers too drunk to respect the trails. I never imagined the forest could remember. I never imagined it could hunt. The first months were normal enough. The silence there is heavy but comforting at first. It presses against you, yes, but in a way that feels alive rather than malicious. Birds calling, wind shifting the leaves, branches creaking like old floorboards. I learned to notice patterns, the way a fox moves, the scent of rain hitting pine, the distant thump of elk hooves. But in hindsight, those months were a countdown. Something was waiting for me to get used to its rhythm before it decided to change the melody. It started with small things, a misplaced trail marker, a footprint that didn't match any animal in the field guide. I shrugged off the first one, blamed my own exhaustion. The second made me uneasy, a boot print, adult male, my size. But I was alone. There should have been no one else. The ground was soft, the snow had melted the night before. Yet the imprint existed, fresh, heading toward my cabin and stopping a few feet from the porch, as if whoever had made it was studying me, invisible but close enough to breathe on my skin. I never saw them, never heard them, just the footprint staring back, mocking, waiting. By the third week, I noticed the shadows, not the usual ones, the shadows trees cast or clouds drift over, but the ones that linger too long, the ones that move when you're not looking directly at them, that appear in reflections in streams, in puddles along the trail, even in the windows of my cabin at night. I would stare into a puddle, think it was my own reflection, and then realize the face wasn't mine. Not exactly. The shape, the curve of the cheek, a blankness in the eyes that my own eyes never carried. It would vanish the second I blinked, and I would tell myself I was imagining it. I had to. To acknowledge it would be to admit there was something in the forest that saw me as I saw nothing, that followed me as I pretended to follow my own routine. Sleep became unreliable. I would wake in the middle of the night hearing voices, whispering, not in any language I knew, sometimes just a rhythm, like someone counting in slow, deliberate breaths beneath the soil. Sometimes words, teasing, calling my name, Daniel, always the same tone, soft, coaxing, patient. It was never intelligible for more than a second before it turned into a hiss or a groan, slipping through the walls of my cabin like smoke. I would wake drenched in sweat, lungs aching from silent screams, heart thrumming in a rhythm that didn't belong to me. Then the animals started avoiding me. Deer would vanish before I could raise my binoculars. Wolves, normally nocturnal, would be gone by dusk. Even the crows stopped calling near the cabin. A silence thicker than the forest's usual one pressed against the air. I rationalized it. Maybe disease, maybe some migratory pattern I hadn't seen before. But rationality is a fragile thing when the forest decides to toy with you. It was on the night of the first snow that I truly understood I was no longer the observer. I was the observed. I was returning from a late check of the northern ridge when I felt it, pressure in the air, the way the trees leaned just slightly toward me, their branches brushing across my shoulders, though the wind had died down. My boots sank silently into the fresh snow, yet I could hear something heavy moving just beyond my vision. A footstep? No. Too large, too deep, too uneven. Something wasn't walking properly. Something was shuffling, dragging, waiting for me to look away. I stopped, rifle raised. Nothing. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I listened. Nothing. Not even the wind, which was odd. Then the smell hit me. Sulfur and burnt hair. My stomach knotted. I've smelled animal death before, wildfire ash, decayed trees, but this was different. It wasn't the smell of something dead. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been waiting. The snow around me darkened as though the forest itself exhaled onto the ground, and I knew for a single sharp second that I was already too late. I ran. No tactical retreat, no measured sprint. I ran until my lungs burned, until the ridge became a blur. Behind me, I heard it. The shuffle, the dragging, the whispering. Not human, not entirely. And then just before I reached the cabin, a voice, my sister's voice, clear, precise, sweet, calling my name. Daniel? I stumbled, frozen, because my sister had disappeared 10 years ago. 10 years. I should have known it was a mimic, a trap, but the forest has a way of ignoring the rules you think govern it. I screamed, and whatever it was fell silent. But the taste of it lingered, metallic and wet, and I have never tasted snow the same way again. I thought it would end there. I thought perhaps it was some break in my mind. Denial is a powerful anesthetic. I tried to maintain routines, check the traps, inspect trails, log observations, but the forest doesn't forgive routine. It punishes predictability. That night, I found something new. My trail logs had been rewritten, not by me. Entries I remembered making, hours spent counting wildlife, noting weather, marking landmarks, were overwritten with phrases I did not recognize. Not English. Symbols, scratches, as if someone or something had taken my handwriting, twisted it into a language designed to unsettle, and placed it in my own hand. I know it sounds impossible. I know it sounds insane. I only know that I touched the page and felt the warmth of my own skin under the ink. Then came the lights. Not from cabins, not from fires. Flickering, moving deep in the trees. Always at night. I would wake in the cabin, and a single point of white light would hover, weaving among the trunks, retreating when I approached. I tried using the truck once, headlights, engine roaring. Nothing moved except the light, which stopped at the edge of the trees and waited. I drove around the perimeter, circled for hours. By the time I returned, my truck's tires had sunk slightly into the frozen ground, deep impressions that weren't there before. And the light? Gone. Sleep stopped entirely. Food lost its flavor, water tasted of iron. I stopped leaving the cabin except when necessary. Even then, I took only the trails I knew best, though the forest had begun to bend familiar paths, trees leaning differently, rocks repositioned, streams rerouted as if the land were alive and hiding something beneath it. And in those moments, I would hear the shuffle again, feel the brushing against my ankle, sense eyes where there should be none. By the time the storm hit, I realized the forest had returned something I had buried long ago, something I had thought forgotten. Guilt, memories, mistakes, buried deep in my youth, in a disappearance I never spoke of, in a sibling I lost and never sought. It came back in whispers, in shadows, in shapes that mimicked humanity but lacked its warmth. It came back to watch, to test, to see if I could survive the reckoning it promised. And that was when the forest started to speak clearly, not through signs or shadows or whispers, but through actions, through the movements of things just beyond my comprehension, things that made the wind curl unnaturally, snow bend toward me, and the earth itself thrum with intent. It was no longer a predator, it was a jury, it was a witness, and I was on trial. The storm lasted 3 days. I remember the wind screaming through the pines like 1,000 voices lost in a canyon, shaking the cabin until the timbers creaked and the snow pressed against the windows in unnatural swells. I stayed inside, rationing what little food remained, but the forest was never silent. It used the storm as a cover, moving freely, dragging branches across the frozen ground, scraping bark against rock, leaving marks that hadn't been there before. I tried to map them, to make sense of a logic I had convinced myself must exist, but each line, each mark, only led me deeper into unease. The trees themselves seemed to bend, twisting at angles that should have been impossible, forming corridors that funneled me where the forest wanted me. I stopped counting the hours. Time became fluid, a rumor whispered in the wind. On the fourth night, the first real sound came from inside the cabin. Something tapped on the wall, a hollow, rhythmic knock like someone counting silently, deliberately. I froze, listening. The sound shifted from wall to wall, around the corners, moving with a precision no human could manage. My rifle lay across the table, heavy and useless. I could feel the vibrations in the floor, tiny at first, then growing as if whatever it was had decided to dance across the timber. The knock stopped abruptly, and then, from the ceiling, a voice, low, intimate, trembling with imitation, whispered, "Daniel." It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't a warning. It was an accusation. I spent the next hours barricading doors, shoving furniture against them, pressing my back into the walls. My rational mind tried to assert control. Drafts, shifting snow, the storm, hallucinations caused by isolation. But reason is a brittle shield when reality begins to erode. I could feel it watching me through the floorboards, through the walls, through the very air I breathed. Every breath became a reminder that the forest had me exactly where it wanted me. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world unnaturally bright, the snow glinting like shattered glass. I forced myself outside. My tracks from the previous day had disappeared, not just covered by snow, gone entirely, erased as if I had never walked the land. I checked the ridgelines, the usual points where elk and deer might appear. Nothing. The silence was suffocating, but it carried movement, subtle and deliberate. I noticed the shadows first, flitting across the snow, angles that contradicted the sun. Then the smell. Not burnt hair this time, but something metallic and wet, like iron and fresh blood mingling in the thawing snow. I gagged, covering my mouth. The scent was too close, too deliberate. I didn't see her at first, just the silhouette, a human shape, standing among the trees, frozen, staring. The light caught it at the wrong angle, obscuring features, but there was no mistaking it. She was a girl I'd known long ago, my sister, or a memory, a shadow, a construct of the forest mocking me. My rational mind screamed that she was dead. She had been dead for 10 years, yet every instinct had told me to move, to approach, to see if this was real. I did neither. I froze. And when I looked back a second later, she was gone. No footprints, no disturbed snow, nothing. The weeks that followed blurred into a waking nightmare. Every trail I followed ended somewhere different than I remembered. Cabins I had passed safely now loomed impossibly large, doors twisted, windows black and reflective, showing shadows where none existed. Streams ran backward or paused mid-flow, water frozen unnaturally in midair as though mocking the natural order. And all the while, I felt it, watching, waiting, judging. One night, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the porch. My cabin door creaked open slowly. I froze under the thin blanket, chest tight, staring into the darkness beyond the window. Something large moved outside, deliberate, careful, aware of my gaze. Then the whispers started again, soft and overlapping, multiple voices speaking in rhythms I couldn't parse. Some called my name. Some spoke in tongues older than English. Some laughed, a hollow, wet laugh that seemed to seep into my bones. I wanted to run, to leave, but the snow outside had shifted into a pattern I couldn't navigate. I realized then that the forest had already changed the rules. There was no exit, not in the way I had known. I became obsessed with tracing my sister's disappearance. Old maps, forgotten records, ranger logs, anything that might explain what had returned. What I found instead were blank spots, areas the official maps never marked. Coordinates that led to nothing, yet felt impossibly familiar. Reports of hikers gone missing, dismissed as accidents or negligence. Places the forest kept as secrets, unrecorded and unremarked. And in those gaps I began to see her. Not physically, but imprints, echoes, traces in snow and mud and even reflected in the sky, like a trail only I could perceive. One evening, after days of following these traces, I stumbled across a hidden shaft. A mine, or perhaps an old bunker, forgotten and unlisted. The entrance was covered in ice and moss, almost invisible from the trail. The moment I approached, the air shifted. It smelled of decay and iron, a mix of the old and the newly disturbed. Shadows danced unnaturally around the edges, responding to my presence. I paused at the opening, staring into the black that led underground. And then I heard it, my sister's voice, clearer than it had ever been, singing something I didn't recognize. It wasn't human, yet it was exactly like her. I debated leaving. Rationally, I knew going in was dangerous. My training screamed that anything moving unseen in the forest was a threat, but the voice, it was a tether to something I couldn't abandon. Guilt, memory, love, and fear twisted into one unbearable weight that pulled me down into that darkness. I entered. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, slick with ice and mud. Every sound echoed, magnified, until the drips of water from the ceiling were gunshots in my ears. My flashlight flickered, shadows leaping, elongating, shapes bending impossibly. And then I saw her, or it. The figure crouched at the far end of the tunnel, motionless. The silhouette was perfect, my sister's height, shape, posture. But the eyes, empty, hollow, reflecting nothing of the person I remembered, watched me. The air in the shaft shifted. Cold pressed against my chest, a living weight. Whispers filled my ears, overlapping with the sound of my heartbeat. Something brushed my ankle, light but deliberate. Not a mistake. I swung my flashlight and the figure vanished. The tunnel stretched longer, darker, twisting in ways that defied geometry, and then I understood. The forest hadn't just returned something I had buried, it had returned everything. Every fear, every regret, every fragment of memory I thought I'd lost, reformed into something that could watch, wait, and punish. I tried to turn back, but the entrance was gone. The shaft opened endlessly, folding in on itself. The walls moved slightly when I blinked, or so it seemed. Light from outside vanished. The forest had swallowed the sky. I realized then that the wilderness had always been a predator, patient and methodical. It did not hunt to feed. It hunted to remember, to make its witnesses pay. And I was the latest witness. Hours, maybe days, passed in that underground maze. The figure appeared intermittently, crouched in shadows, reflected in puddles, mirrored in the metal walls of some forgotten door. Always silent, always still, but never gone. Whispers suggested corridors I could not see, and I walked, stumbled, ran, each turn only leading me deeper. And the worst part, the hallucinations were real enough to fool me. I began speaking to her, arguing, pleading, accusing. Only later did I realize the words came from me, or perhaps from the forest through me, a parasite of memory and guilt twisting my mind. I don't remember how I survived the first week underground. Every step threatened to undo me. The air was thick with sulfur and iron, mixed with something sweet and rotten I couldn't place. My flashlight dimmed, then failed, leaving me in a black so complete it felt tactile. My senses fractured. I couldn't distinguish the smell of water from blood, the echo of my own footsteps from those behind me. And in the silence between breaths, I understood the forest had become me, and I had become it. The previous day had disappeared, not just covered by snow, but gone entirely, erased as if I had never walked the land. I checked the ridgelines, the usual points where elk and deer might appear. Nothing. The silence was suffocating, yet it carried movement, subtle and deliberate. I noticed the shadows first, flitting across the snow, angles that contradicted the sun. Then the smell. Not burnt hair this time, but something metallic and wet, like iron and fresh blood mingling in the thawing snow. I gagged, covering my mouth. The scent was too close, too deliberate. I didn't see her at first, just the silhouette, a human shape standing among the trees, frozen, staring. The light caught it at the wrong angle, obscuring features, but there was no mistaking it. She was a girl I'd known long ago. My sister, or a memory, a shadow, a construct of the forest mocking me. My rational mind screamed that she was dead, that she had been dead for 10 years. Yet every instinct I had told me to move, to approach, to see if this was real, I did neither. I froze, and when I looked back a second later, she was gone. No footprints, no snow disturbed. Nothing. The weeks that followed blurred into a waking nightmare. Every trail I followed ended somewhere different than I remembered. Cabins I had once passed safely now loomed impossibly large, doors twisted, windows black and reflective, showing shadows where none existed. Streams ran backward or paused mid-flow, water frozen unnaturally in midair as though mocking the natural order. And all the while I felt it, watching, waiting, judging. One night, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the porch. My cabin door creaked open slowly. I froze under the thin blanket, chest tight, staring into the darkness beyond the window. Something large moved outside, deliberate, careful, aware of my gaze. Then the whispers started again, soft and overlapping, multiple voices speaking in rhythms I couldn't parse. Some called my name. Some spoke in tongues older than English. Some laughed. A hollow, wet laugh that seemed to seep into my bones. I wanted to run, to leave, but the snow outside had shifted into a pattern I couldn't navigate. I realized then the forest had already changed the rules. There was no exit, not in the way I had known. I became obsessed with tracing my sister's disappearance. Old maps, forgotten records, ranger logs, anything that might explain what had returned. What I found instead were blank spots, areas the official maps never marked, coordinates that led to nothing, yet felt impossibly familiar. Reports of hikers gone missing, dismissed as accidents or negligence, places the forest held as secrets, unrecorded and unremarked. And in those gaps, I began to see her. Not physically, but as imprints, echoes, traces in snow and mud, even reflected in the sky like a trail only I could perceive. One evening, after days of following these traces, I stumbled across a hidden shaft, a mine, or perhaps an old bunker, forgotten and unlisted. The entrance was covered in ice and moss, almost invisible from the trail. The moment I approached, the air shifted. It smelled of decay and iron, a mix of the old and the newly disturbed. The shadows danced unnaturally around the edges, responding to my presence. I paused at the opening, staring into the black that led underground. And then I heard it, my sister's voice, clearer than it had ever been, singing something I didn't recognize. It wasn't human, yet it was exactly like her. I debated leaving. Rationally, I knew that going in was dangerous. My training screamed that anything moving unseen in the forest was a threat. But the voice, it was a tether to something I couldn't abandon. Guilt, memory, love, and fear twisted into one unbearable weight that pulled me down into that darkness. I entered. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, slick with ice and mud. Every sound echoed, magnified, until the drips of water from the ceiling were gunshots in my ears. My flashlight flickered, shadows leaping, elongating, shapes bending impossibly. And then I saw her, or it. The figure crouched at the far end of the tunnel, motionless. The silhouette was perfect, my sister's height, shape, posture. But the eyes, empty, hollow, reflecting nothing of the person I remembered, watched me. The air in the shaft shifted. Cold pressed against my chest, a living weight. Whispers filled my ears, overlapping with the sound of my heartbeat. Something brushed my ankle, light but deliberate, not a mistake. I swung my flashlight and the figure vanished. The tunnel stretched longer, darker, twisting in ways that defied geometry, and then I understood. The forest hadn't just returned something I buried, it had returned everything. Every fear, every regret, every fragment of memory I thought I'd lost, reformed into something that could watch, wait, and punish. I tried to turn back, but the entrance was gone. The shaft opened endlessly, folding in on itself. Walls moved slightly when I blinked, or so it seemed. Light from outside vanished. The forest had swallowed the sky. I realized then that the wilderness had always been a predator, patient, methodical. It did not hunt to feed. It hunted to remember, to make its witnesses pay. And I was the latest witness. Hours, maybe days, passed in that underground maze. The figure appeared intermittently, crouched in shadows reflected in puddles, mirrored in the metal walls of some forgotten door, always silent, always still, but never gone. Whispers suggested corridors I could not see, and I walked, stumbled, ran, each turn only leading me deeper. And the worst part, the hallucinations were real enough to fool me. I began speaking to her, arguing, pleading, accusing. Only later did I realize the words came from me, or perhaps from the forest through me, a parasite of memory and guilt twisting my mind. I don't know how I survived the first week underground. Every step threatened to undo me. The air was thick with sulfur and iron, mixed with something sweet and rotten I couldn't place. My flashlight dimmed, then failed, leaving me in black so complete it felt tactile. My senses fractured. I couldn't distinguish the smell of water from blood, the echo of my own footsteps from those behind me. And in the silence between breaths, I understood the forest had become me, and I had become it. I don't remember how long I wandered those corridors. Days, nights. It didn't matter. The darkness erased them, and the whispers made time meaningless. I could feel the walls pulsing, subtle vibrations mirroring my heartbeat. Every corner I turned held a shadow I recognized, a memory twisted into form. My sister's laughter, warped and hollow, echoed off the stone. I hated myself for expecting it to be her, and I hated myself more for following the sound anyway. Then I found the door. Unlike the others, metal, reinforced, rusted shut, with scratches suggesting some terrible struggle from within. The marks weren't uniform. They varied in depth, direction, and spacing, as though something or someone had been trying to write a desperate message, and the letters had been eaten by some unseen force. The air was heavier here, thick with decay and iron, with an almost imperceptible hum, like the world itself vibrating in pain. I tried to open it. My hands slipped on the cold metal. The flashlight flickered. Then I heard it, not a voice, but a rhythm, a heartbeat, low and deliberate, in perfect time with mine. My chest constricted. Rational thought dissolved into terror. I couldn't run. I couldn't turn back. Something beneath that door waited, patient and sentient. I found a crowbar. The sound of metal against metal rang like a bell through the underground maze, echoing endlessly. The door shuddered, resisted, then gave. I hesitated at the threshold. The air beyond smelled of wet stone, something older than memory, and a faint trace of her perfume, or what my mind insisted must be her perfume, hung in the cold. I forced myself inside. The space beyond was vast, impossibly so, a cavern stretching into infinity. The walls glimmered faintly with mineral deposits, catching what little light my failing flashlight provided. I saw shapes moving in the periphery, figures crouched, watching, mimicking humans I once knew. My sister appeared again, then vanished, replaced by something taller, darker, limbs impossibly long, moving with calculated patience. It mirrored me, studied me, made my every movement deliberate. I fell to the ground, exhausted. My mind frayed. The whispers grew in number, layers of voices, some mimicking my own thoughts. You cannot leave. You cannot forget. My own voice joined the chorus. I realized, in a wave of horror, that the forest could speak through me, that it had taken every fragment of guilt, fear, and regret I had buried and turned them against me. Every rational thought I clung to was stripped away, replaced with survival instincts that felt alien. Something brushed my shoulder. Cold. Hard. Not entirely solid. I spun, catching only a shimmer of movement. Shadows elongated into forms I couldn't describe, yet each carried a horrifying familiarity, human enough to deceive, alien enough to terrify. I scrambled forward blindly, stumbling over roots or bones, or both. Every step seemed measured, anticipated. The forest had learned me. It had learned my patterns, my mistakes, my fears, and it exploited them. Deeper in the cavern, I found what looked like a settlement, crude structures carved from stone and debris. Huddled figures moved in silence, faces featureless, body language deliberate and ritualistic. They watched me as I entered, but did not react. One figure stepped forward, a perfect replica of my father. I froze. He spoke in my father's voice, calling my name, demanding answers I couldn't provide. I knew instantly it wasn't him, not my father. But the imitation was so flawless, the cadence so precise, that my mind bent in recognition. I wanted to run, but the ground shifted beneath me. What I had thought was solid rock was flexible, pulsing with unseen life. Every corner revealed new horrors. Water running backward, walls closing in, then opening wider, reflections in puddles showing me alive but broken, a version of myself already consumed by the forest. My senses betrayed me. The air tasted metallic and sweet. My hands itched with phantom burns. I began hallucinating touch, temperature, and smell as one continuous assault. I found myself in the center of the cavern at a pit surrounded by jagged stones. Shapes hovered above it, suspended or waiting. I couldn't tell. A figure crouched at the edge, unmistakably my sister. Yet wrong. Longer limbs, eyes reflecting nothing, lips moving with no sound. I heard the whispers coalesce into words I could almost understand. You buried her. You buried yourself. You cannot leave. Then the ground beneath me gave way. I fell into darkness, the pit swallowing me. My flashlight shattered, plunging me into blackness so complete it felt physical, like thick water pressing against my face. The whispers became deafening. Rational thought dissolved, shapes danced at the edges of my vision, impossible angles, grotesque imitations of human forms, circling, waiting. I clawed at the walls, only to find them soft, pliable, as if the forest itself had become flesh. I screamed. My voice echoed endlessly, returning twisted, imitating my terror, mocking my weakness. And yet I felt it. The presence, the predator that had been following me, patient, intelligent. I realized it didn't want me dead. Not exactly. It wanted me to remember. It wanted me to see, to feel, to understand that the forest had taken every fragment of my life, every mistake, and would return it not in closure, but in reflection, warped, cruel, endless. I thought of the cabin, the ridge, the footprints in the snow, the shadowed figure that had first drawn me in. I understood then that nothing I had seen, nothing I had remembered, was accidental. The forest had always known me, and in its memory it had constructed a trial, a labyrinth of guilt and terror designed to fracture my mind completely. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time became meaningless. Hunger, thirst, pain, these existed, yet they were secondary to the assault on my senses and memory. Every sound, smell, and shadow was a message. Every corner I turned, every figure mimicking my loved ones, every whisper becoming my own thoughts. It was all part of the reckoning. And somewhere deep in the cavern, I heard a sound I recognized. The beating of a heart. Not mine. Not human. Steady, deliberate, watching, waiting. It was the forest, speaking in the only way it knew, through life, through memory, through the unrelenting reflection of everything I had buried and thought forgotten. I understood, finally, that this was not an ending. There would be no resolution, only the forest, patient and eternal, returning to me piece by piece, until there was nothing left of Daniel Shaw but what the wilderness demanded, until nothing remained of Daniel Shaw but the fragments the wilderness demanded. I found myself crawling through what felt like a narrow vein in the rock, squeezed between walls that pulsed softly, as if they had a heartbeat of their own. The air was stifling, but it carried whispers of memories not my own, cries of people I had never met, laughter from children who never existed, and pleas from hikers who would never return. Each sound seemed layered atop the other, a choir of torment, a map of loss written in audio. I pressed forward, dragging my broken body along, because stopping meant becoming part of that chorus, a shadow among shadows. The space widened into a cavern that defied logic. Stalactites hung like teeth, stalagmites jutted from the ground, some curving unnaturally, meeting in arches that formed impossible tunnels. Water dripped with a resonant metallic clang, each drop echoing as though it fell in a chamber 10 times larger than the space should allow. Shadows moved along the walls, sometimes separate, sometimes merging, always imitating the forms of people I knew. I thought I saw my old partner from the ranger service, the one who had disappeared on a trail I once surveyed. His face was blurred, features melting, yet he waved at me, beckoning me closer. I recoiled, but something deeper, a pull I could not resist, urged me forward. Then I found her again. My sister, crouched in a pool of black water, her reflection fractured, multiplied, impossible to reconcile with reality. Her eyes locked onto mine, hollow yet familiar. I tried to speak, to reach her, but the water rippled violently, reacting to the sound of my voice as though the cavern itself had ears. Something moved beneath the surface, a mass vast and fluid, yet structured, intelligent. The whispers rose, voices overlapping, imitating mine, hers, and strangers, forming a chant I could not follow but felt compelled to obey. I realized that the forest, or what the forest had become, was testing me, stripping my memories, my reason, my sense of self. Each hallucination, figure, and impossible corridor was a mirror of my guilt. Every misstep in the real world, every choice that had led to disappearances, every time I had failed someone, had been catalogued. And now, the wilderness was returning them all, not as closure, but as torment. My body began to betray me. Muscles cramped, joints popped. I stumbled, fell, clawed at slick walls. My flashlight, the last thread of reason, dimmed to a ghost of itself. The air grew thick, heavy, oppressive, pressing against my chest as though the cavern itself were breathing down on me. I heard the pulse of something immense, something below, a rhythm matching my own heartbeat in impossible harmony. The whispers became screams, overlapping my thoughts until I could no longer separate intention from hallucination. I stumbled into a gallery of skeletal remains, twisted and unrecognizable. Some seemed human, some were grotesquely altered. Bones were arranged in patterns like messages or warnings. The air reeked of decay, but beneath it lingered a sweetness, something organic and alive yet rotting at the same time. I could not tell whether I was looking at remnants of the past or projections of what the forest wanted me to see. And in the corner, a figure mimicked me perfectly, shadowing my every movement. I swung my flashlight. It vanished. But I could feel it, always just beyond perception, waiting. Then came the sound that broke me, a single, deliberate knock from deep inside the rock, echoing in my bones. 1, 2, 3. Not random, patterned, counting. It was the same rhythm from the cabin as the one I had dismissed as wind or storm. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that the cabin was hundreds of miles away. Yet I knew in that instant that nothing here adhered to normal rules. The forest had folded time and space, and I was trapped within its logic. I reached what I thought was the end of the cavern, a vertical drop into blackness that seemed to descend infinitely. The walls pulsed, the heartbeat intensified, and I understood with sick clarity that this was the culmination. The forest had built this path for me, a final chamber where all I had buried, every sin and mistake, would confront me at once. I slid down, hands scraping against wet stone, and landed in a chamber suffused with a faint, sickly light. Shadows clung to the walls, some human-shaped, others grotesque parodies. In the center, a pit opened, black as obsidian, and I heard the slow, methodical breathing of something vast within. Figures circled it, mimicking the movements of people I had loved and lost, their eyes hollow yet unyielding. And there she was, my sister, kneeling at the edge of the pit, arms outstretched, lips moving, whispering my name. I understood then. The forest did not merely return what was buried. It demanded recognition. It demanded suffering. It wanted a witness, and I was that witness. I tried to step back, but the ground shifted beneath me. Corridors rearranged, the walls breathed, and the pit widened, pulling me forward with an invisible force. I screamed. My voice bounced back, twisted, mocking, and I realized that this chamber, this pit, was alive. Not alive like an animal, but alive like memory, guilt, and fear made flesh. The whispers intensified, calling every name I had known, every word I had ever spoken, every regret I had buried. Shadows moved faster, merging, splitting, forming new shapes. And then the realization struck me like ice in my chest. I could never leave. The forest did not allow exits. It did not forgive. It simply waited, patient, methodical, eternal, using every trick, every fragment of the past to ensure that those who entered never truly escaped. I fell to my knees at the edge of the pit. My flashlight died completely, leaving me in darkness so absolute it felt alive. I could feel the breath of the cavern on my face, something warm and wet, a reminder that the forest was not just around me, it was within me. The whispers softened, now perfectly synchronized with my thoughts, inseparable, convincing me that the forest's voice was my own. And in that moment, I understood. There was no rescue, no return, no final escape, only the reckoning. Only the forest, patient, eternal, and all-consuming. Nothing remained of the man I once was. I tumbled through the darkness, the pit seeming to extend into eternity. The walls, if they could even be called walls, pulsed and breathed around me, moist and warm. Every inch of space was alive, sentient, responding to my movements. The shadows, elongated and shifting, followed with impossible grace. I felt them brushing my limbs, my back, my face, not solid, yet undeniable. My own hands sometimes passed through them, and sometimes met resistance that was excruciating. The whispers became a singular voice, unrelenting, insistent, patient. You are the forest. The forest is you. There is no escape. You buried what belonged to it, and it returns to claim you. I could not discern if it was the voice of the forest, my own guilt, or the lingering echoes of those I had failed. Perhaps it was all three, and more. My mind, already frayed, struggled to maintain the thin thread of rationality. Every step I took was preordained, and the cavern guided me forward, folding space and time around itself. I stumbled into a chamber that made the previous ones pale in comparison. It was vast, a cathedral of stone and living matter, walls glimmering with veins of mineral that pulsed like arteries. Figures stood silently, almost statuesque, each one a perfect imitation of someone I had known. Friends, colleagues, strangers whose names I had forgotten, my sister, my father. Their eyes were empty yet aware. As I moved, they mimicked me, step for step, expression for expression, mocking my hesitation, my fear. In the center of the chamber, an opening revealed a blackness that was almost liquid in its depth. From it, I could hear the low, deliberate pulse of a heartbeat, accompanied by a sound I recognized instantly. My own name, whispered over and over in overlapping tones from voices familiar and alien, human and inhuman. I approached, compelled by some need I could not define, unable to resist the pull that had guided me through every corridor, every mimicry, every hallucination. Then I saw her clearly, kneeling at the edge of the void. My sister, or the memory of her, stretched and twisted, elongated, with eyes that reflected nothing but shadows. She held out her hand, beckoning me, lips moving silently. The air was thick with her scent, perfume and decay entwined. The forest had recreated her, and yet she was not her. She was the forest itself, and through her it spoke to me, accusing, instructing, punishing. I reached toward her. The ground beneath me shivered, pulsing like a living thing, and I fell to my knees, my chest pressed against it. I could feel the vibration of every heartbeat in the cavern, the resonance of every shadow, the rhythm of every imitation that had haunted me. My own thoughts had become indistinguishable from the whispers. I could not remember what was real, what was memory, and what was invention. I was consumed entirely by the forest's will, and yet at the same time I understood it. A movement caught my eye, something rising from the darkness of the pit. It was enormous, impossible, a presence that seemed to fill the chamber without space or limit. Its limbs, or what I perceived as limbs, mimicked those of humans but were elongated, folded, intersecting at angles that made no sense. Its face was a mirror of mine, and yet I could see every flaw I had tried to hide, every secret, every moment of weakness. It watched me, measured me, waited for me to acknowledge it. I understood then that this was not a creature in the conventional sense. It was memory, time, and the forest incarnate. It was patience and inevitability, a predator that did not need to hunt because it already knew its prey. My guilt, my shame, my regrets, they had been harvested, cultivated, and weaponized against me. The forest had returned everything I had buried, not as mercy, not as closure, but as an execution in slow motion. I fell to the edge of the void, staring into the blackness, hearing the whispers crescendo into a scream that was both mine and not mine. The air pressed against my lungs, thick and suffocating, carrying the metallic tang of blood and the sweet decay of memories. Every figure in the chamber tilted toward me, waiting. The longer I looked, the more impossible it became to distinguish who they were, who I was, and what was real. The ground quivered beneath me, the pit seemed to breathe, and then I understood, with a clarity that burned into my consciousness. The forest never forgives. The forest never forgets. It waits, patient and eternal, to return to those who think they can bury their mistakes, their sins, their loved ones, and their own shame. It will return them, piece by piece, until there is nothing left but the reckoning itself. I tried to move backward, but the chamber shifted. Walls curved, Shadows elongated, echoes of my own movements returned to me, distorted, mocking. I fell forward into the pit, or perhaps the pit rose to meet me, and the darkness enveloped me entirely. My last coherent thought, if it can be called a thought, was a single cold recognition. I was the prey, and I had always been the forest's quarry. I cannot say how long I have been here. Time has dissolved. Hunger and thirst exist, but they are distant, irrelevant. My senses betray me, constructing and deconstructing reality in a constant, infinite cycle. Every step I take, every shadow that moves in tandem with me, every whisper that imitates my thoughts reinforces the truth. There is no outside. There is no rescue. There is only the forest, patient, eternal, and infinitely cruel. And so, I wait. I whisper my own name into the darkness, hoping someone or something will answer. I feel the pulse of the cavern in my bones, the shadows on my skin, the echoes of every misstep I have ever taken. I know that anyone who enters will meet me, or the memory of me, and that the forest will claim them as it claimed me. There is no conclusion here, only warning, only reflection, only the inevitable return. The forest remembers, and one day, it will return to you, too.